Hello, my little mathematicians. Today, we're going to focus on identifying the independent and dependent variable from both a table and a graph. Okay, so first of all, let's review. The independent variable isn't changed by the other variable, versus the dependent variable is the quantity that depends upon what happens to the other variable. So to identify them, a lot of times what I do is I'll say the phrase, this depends upon that. And then one way will always make more sense than the other. And then I'll know which one's the dependent and which one's the independent. And don't worry, we'll do that within the practice. You'll see. Okay, or you can think of it as the cause and effect. So your dependent one is what's affected by what happens, whatever you do to this one. Okay, and so the y is the dependent variable. It's the one on the y-axis. And the x is the independent variable. It's the one on the horizontal or x-axis. One way to identify the x versus the y, because some people are like, how do you remember that y is the dependent one? Okay, think of it this way. Why did you make so much money? Well, because I made a lot of money depending upon how much I sold. So how much money I make depends on how much I sell, right? And so if you can ask yourself, like, why did I do well on the test? Well, how well you do depends upon how much you studied. Also, equations. You normally do something to the x, right? You add something to x, you subtract something, you multiply something to x. So x is like the cause. You're doing something to the x, and then that affects your answer of y. And you'll see later when you get into more specific graphing, you get the equation y equals something x. So you do something to the x, and it affects your answer of y. And your answer depends upon whatever you did to the x. So hopefully like all that together kind of helps you remember that y is the dependent one and x is the independent one. Okay, so you do something to x, you can do whatever you want, but whatever you do affects your answer of y. Okay, now let's go ahead and actually try some of these. So for the first one, example one, they say, Danny opened a savings account with $50 and deposited $10 each week for 4 weeks. And then they gave me a little table. So at the start, he had $50 because that's how much he put in. Then each week after that, it increases by 10, right? So as 1 week goes by, it increases by $10 each time you go up another week, in case you were asked to complete the table yourself. Now, to identify the independent and dependent variable of which one's what. Well, say that phrase, blank depends upon blank. One way will make more sense. How much money I make depends on the number of weeks I saved. Okay. The number of weeks I saved depends upon how much money I can't even finish the sentence. It just doesn't make sense, right? The other way totally flowed. How much money I make depends on how long I've been saving. So this is my dependent variable, how much money I've made. So the dependent is the money I've saved. And remember, that's your y. So your answer depends upon x, which is number of weeks that you've been saving. So if somebody were to ask you, wow, how do you have so much money? Well, I have that much money because I've been saving for a long time. Okay. There you go. The dependent is the y, and it's talking about the money saved. The independent is x, which is talking about the number of weeks that you've been saving. Why don't you see if you can identify the independent versus the dependent for example 2? Okay. So did you try saying the phrase blank depends upon blank? How much money you've received depends upon the number of carnations you sell. And you're like, well, how do you know that's what I was talking about? Don't just look at the table, look up at the problem above it too. It says student government is selling carnations for Valentine's Day for $2 each. So right here, if you bought 10 carnations, 10 times 2 is 20. If you buy 20, 20 times 2 is 40. And that's how they completed the table. if you read it, how much money you make or receive depends upon the number of carnations that were sold. Or the number of carnations that were sold depends upon how much money you make. No, it doesn't. That doesn't even make sense. Okay, so again, money both times has been Y. That usually is a trend. Money usually is the Y, as just a helpful little hint. I'd say like 98% of the time. So when in doubt, money is usually your Y, or your dependent variable. So how much money received depends on X, the number of carnations sold. Now that's if I were to identify this from a table. But what if you needed to identify the independent versus dependent from a graph? Okay. Well, this is saying Derek's earnings from lawn mowing is shown in the graph below. So the number of lawns mowed and then the earnings, or the amount of money made. So the number of lawns mowed depends upon how much money he made. Not really. How much money you make depends upon how many lawns you made. How many lawns you mowed. Yeah, that way makes more sense. And again, this is your Y. So your money earned depends on the number of lawns mowed. So this is dependent upon that. If you mow more lawns, you make more money. If you don't mow that many lawns, you're not going to make that much money. So how much money you make depends upon how much of this you do. An easier way too, if you're still like, I still don't get like saying it one way versus the other, it doesn't make sense to me. When it's in a graph, it basically gives you the answer, because we know your answer depends upon what you do to X, right? So this is your Y. And look, on the Y-axis, it was talking about this. So it told you, hey, Y is earnings. And then the X-axis is the independent. So on the X-axis, it's talking about number of lawns mowed. So it told you that the X, or independent, was the number of lawns mowed. So in a graph, it basically gives you the answer, doesn't it? Okay, so why don't you do number 4? Okay, so you paused it, you tried it, and now you're back with us. So the dependent, or Y, is right here. Okay, again, it's talking about your earnings, your money. And the X, or independent, is talking about the number of hours that you work. Now notice that there's another question for this, and it's saying how much is earned per lawn. So sometimes you might see that also as asked as the rate. So what's the rate in which this is done, or the rate of change? All of this is asking if they want to find the amount of this per that. How much is earned per lawn? So on top, they want the money earned. On bottom, so after the word per, they want the number of lawns. Even if they didn't specify that, if they just said what's the rate of change, it's always going to be your change in the Y over your change in the X. So here they gave it to you that this is the Y and this is the X. So again, they said, hey, the money earned is the Y and the per lawn, so lawns is the X. So I find a coordinate point right here, and I find another coordinate point right here, because see how it goes a straight line, it starts at 0, 0. So find the change in Y. It went from 0 to 50. So the change in Y was 50. From this point to this point, it went up 50. Over the change in X, it went from 0 to 2, right? From this point. So it went from 0 to 2. So it's a change of 2 in the X's. We'll reduce that because you want to know per lawn, so you want the denominator to become 1. So let's divide by 2. And you get 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 50 divided by 2 is 25. Which means take the top number, that's 25, and put the unit with it. Well, Y was talking about money, so 25 bucks per, the bottom number is 1, and it's talking about the number of lawns mowed. So it's $25 per one lawn, or just per lawn. And that would be what's called your rate if they ever ask for you to identify the rate. Okay, so see if you could try this one. How much is earned per hour? Okay, so they want the change in Y. It went from what to what? Well, from this point right here, okay, it started at 0, 0, and then it went from 0 to 21. So the change in Y was 21 over, it went from 0 to 3. So the change in X was 3. And it wants to know per hour, so it wants your denominator to become 1. So divide it by itself. Whatever you do the bottom, do the top. So 21 divided by 3 is 7. 3 divided by 3 is 1, which means you did $7 per 1 hour, or just per hour. That was your rate for this one. Now, even though it didn't ask, see if you can find the rate of change for these. And you're like, I don't understand, like there's not points. Well, this is a coordinate point. When X is 0, Y is 50. So there's a coordinate point, 0, 50. When X is 1, Y is 60. That's another coordinate point. So find the change from here to here in X's, and the change in Y from here to here was 10. So the change in Y over the change in X. Well, Y went up by 10 every time X went up by 1. So it's $10, because that's what Y was talking about, per 1. What's X talking about? The number of weeks. And that would be your rate for this problem, $10 per week. And hey, that's what it was talking about. It says as a rate of $10 per week. Okay, what about this one? If I were to find the rate of change, it would still be the change in Y over the change in X. So from here to here, the Y, it went up by 20. So it's a positive 20 over, from X, it went from 10 to 20, which is up 10. So it's a change in 20 over a change in 10, which could totally reduce to 2 over 1. So 2, that unit is talking about, remember, Y over X. Y is talking about money. So it's $2 per 1. X is talking about number of carnations sold. So per carnation sold. You could put 1 in front, but it's implied that it's just 1 when it says per carnation sold. There you go. And that's your rate. You make $2 per carnation sold. And that totally lines up with what they told me up there. But in case that information was left out and they asked you to identify the rate, that's how you would do it. It's the change in Y over the change in X. So now you are a master of identifying the independent versus dependent variable from both a table and a graph. Remember that phrase, blank depends upon blank. Y is your answer, okay? Y equals something X. Something's done to the X and it affects your Y, which is your answer. Okay, so dependent is Y, independent is X. You can identify it from both a table and a graph, and you can use it to find your rate of change. Congratulations on mastering yet another math standard.